Hello, it is in fact Mr. Grow, and today we're going to be talking about Americans with disabilities. But as per usual, before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this lesson, let's go over a little bit of the history of the discrimination that this group has faced. Throughout history, people with disabilities, especially if you were a person of color or a woman, they received a ton of discrimination. They were often, dehumanized, used for entertainment. People were made to feel less because of their physical appearance. And an example of this would be like freak shows, like the circus for a long time had a really bad problem with this. Immigrants would be sent home from Ellis Island. Remember way back from first semester when they had to do that medical examination? If you had any sort of disability, you would be sent back home. On the bright side, we had people like Dorothea Dix, who in like the mid-1800s did some really pioneering work in treating people with mental illnesses and other disabilities. Really treating them as humans who were just sick and, needed help, rather than freak shows or subhumans, things like that. Back on the dark side of things, there was also eugenics. This is really popular in sort of the early 1900s, kind of turn of the century era. Think about the same period of time where America was doing its imperialism. I could do an entire video on eugenics, but basically it was the theory that some people were just inherently superior than others. The best way I can describe it is like selective breeding from like a dog. You breed certain dogs together to get desirable traits. Well, the people that subscribe to the theory of eugenics did that, but with people. Actually, Nazism has some pretty close ties with eugenics. And if you were found to be not fit to carry your genes to the next generation, to not make the superior race of people, you would be forced to be sterilized. This normally would happen to people who were disabled, or even members of the LGBTQ community were sterilized a lot during this time. But yeah, it was some pretty dark stuff. There were also instances where people were forced to become disabled against their will. The Tuskegee experiments were a very clear example of this. It was when the government conducted studies on untreated syphilis in black men in Alabama. Penicillin was a cure at the time. We knew how to cure syphilis, but they just didn't give them the medicine because they wanted to just see what happened. And they had some pretty serious medical side effects, like some lifelong medical side effects as a result. And yeah, again, some pretty dark stuff. And of course, there were the Hiroshima Maidens. This was a group of women who were left with horrific burns and radiation sickness from the initial flash of the nuclear weapon dropped on Hiroshima. And before we get too much further into this lesson, it would be useful for you to know what a disability is. So, an individual with a disability is defined by the ADA as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person who has a history or a record of such impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. This can include major physical things like a loss of a limb, major skin burns, paralysis, stuff like that. There are the, quote, invisible physical disabilities like asthma, arthritis, fibromyalgia, things that affect you but, aren't really visible to other people. There's long-term illnesses like ALS, multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, that kind of stuff. There's cognitive disabilities like dyslexia, autism, ADHD, memory loss, dementia, and Alzheimer's. There's visual and auditory disabilities like loss, impairment, and processing barriers. There's exposure to chemicals like mesothelioma. That's the syndrome from being exposed to asbestos. You might remember the commercials that were all over the place about a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago. And there's also mental health disabilities like depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, OCD, things like that. So as you can see, disability is a pretty broad term that includes a lot of Americans. 26%, in fact. You'll see that statistic in our live session. So the 1973 Rehabilitation Act provided the first civil rights protection for people with disabilities. Under this, the exclusion and the segregation of persons with disabilities was viewed as discrimination, and it included Section 504, which said no program receiving federal funds can discriminate based on disability. And educational 504 plans provide accommodations based on anything that impedes the ability to learn. 504 plans are very common today, and we're going to talk more about this in class. But yeah, lots of people have 504 plans, and they're very helpful to helping everyone meet their learning goals. This also shifted the policy to view people with disabilities as a minority group instead of by category of disability, as was previously done before. And then the Reagan administration attempted to deregulate Section 504, but the show of force led them to halt these efforts. And we'll show you a video on that in class. It was the 504 sit-ins. I will give you a sneak peek of it right now, though. So Section 504 couldn't be implemented until the U.S. Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, those all used to be in the same department, issued regulations for its enforcement. As legislators called for studies of the impact of implementing Section 504 and protesting rewriting regulations to make them less comprehensive, an action dragged on for more than 3 years. By 1977, people had had enough. And all over the country, people with disabilities occupied and staged sit-ins. This shouldn't surprise you at this point. Sit-ins are a very common way and very effective way to, cause a scene and make your voice heard and get something done. And these were done at the Department of Health and Education and Welfare buildings. And the longest was in San Francisco, and it lasted 28 days. And really, this is an example of the fact that just because you pass a piece of legislation doesn't mean it's going to magically go into effect and magically fix things. We've seen this too many times throughout history. Last week's video about the civil unrest post-1965 was another example of this. We had the Voters' Rights Act, we had the Civil Rights Act, and yet things didn't magically get better. It takes not only legislation, but it takes an educated public and for people to actually get behind and understand the people that have these conditions and why they need more help. A couple years later, in 1979, we took another step back. So in this case, the Southeastern Community College v. Davis, I'll spare you all the details, but basically the court decided that Mrs. Davis' hearing impairment rendered her unqualified to participate in the program because she wouldn't be able to fully fulfill all of the clinical requirements. And the court said that, well, sorry, you can't participate, and no one's really legally obligated to make these accommodations for you, so bye. And you know what? This in particular makes me sick because, guys, I just got done with like a year's worth of college courses on all of the reasons why this is deplorable and should not be allowed. By this, I mean discriminating against people and not giving them the accommodations that they need. But yeah, when this court case was decided, it cast some real doubt about whether or not accommodations would ever be like mandated to allow everybody to participate in anything, regardless, to the best extent possible, regardless of their disabilities. So after that decision, naturally, people with disabilities and allies of people with disabilities were a little angry. So I'll spare you the legal jargon of this next case here, but basically what you need to know in Consolidated Rail Corporation v. Daron, it marked a significant victory for the disability rights community. The court found that employment discrimination was in fact prohibited by Section 504. But equally importantly, the court found that regulations issued in 1977 by the HUE, that's the Health, Education, and Welfare Department, were entitled to great deference by the courts. And that means that the courts had the liberty to interpret that kind of stuff. And basically, this made the basis of the ADA, and we'll get to that in just a second. And real quick, just some little bonus tidbits of legislation knowledge and cases. In 1987, there was the School Board of Nassau County versus Arline. And that expanded protections to people with AIDS and other infectious diseases. Side note, you guys ever read a word and you read the word all the time, and then as soon as you go to say it out loud, your brain falls apart because you've never heard it out loud? Anyways, I'm wasting time. I'm wasting your valuable time. Legislation was passed to reinstate provisions to all airlines, provide the right to sue states for violations of Section 504, and the right of patients to recover attorney fees under IDEA. And we will talk about IDEA in just a second. But before we do that, it's time for our reoccurring segment, Historical Figure Spotlights. That's right, we're sneaking one in here. This time it's Sarah Reinersten, and Mrs. Myers had the pleasure of meeting her. So Sarah had her leg amputated as a young girl due to a tissue disease, and as you can see, it was a pretty serious amputation, almost at the hip. Being a lover of sports, Sarah didn't let the loss of a leg stop her. She, with one leg, did something that I, with two legs, will never do, the Ironman triathlon. She was also named the Outstanding Young Californian. She participated in the Paralympics, and she became the first amputee to compete in not one, not two, but 7 marathons on all 7 continents in 7 days. Imagine the jet lag alone. No thank you. How did she do this? You know what? There's actually a lot of really cool, influential people with disabilities. So we have the North Carolina representative, Madison Cawthorn. Madison Cawthorn. He's in a wheelchair. Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth is a double amputee. Joe Biden has a disability. He has that stutter. And Texas Governor Greg Abbott is also in a wheelchair. And not to mention, figures like FDR and others, but we're going to talk about them in class. Okay, so here's the big dog, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, or ADA, as is commonly abbreviated as. So the ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. It also applies to the United States Congress. To be protected by the ADA, one must have a disability or have a relationship or association with an individual with a disability. An individual with a disability is defined by the ADA as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. You'll remember that definition from way back at the beginning of this video. So basically, anytime that you see like a handicap stall or ramp or braille on like an ATM or anything like that, that you can thank the ADA. And some more examples of this, ramps on buses. In fact, the buses, super cool, and like they have the air suspension. They kneel down on one side, ADA. And then, of course, the classic signage that's everywhere, ramps outside of public buildings. I mentioned Braille. There's the devices that can lower people in wheelchairs so they can go swimming. And, of course, accommodations in various building plans and education, that kind of stuff. And now, I told you we mentioned this before, IDEA, it's time we get back to it. This is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So IDEA requires public school systems to develop appropriate individualized education programs, or IEPs, for each child. The specific special education-related services outlined in each IEP reflects the individualized needs of each student. And again, IEPs are another very common thing, and they're extremely helpful for a lot of students. And they're helpful to educators who are doing everything that they can to give students the best education possible. IDEA also mandates that particular procedures be followed in the development of the IEP. Each student's IEP must be developed by a team of knowledgeable persons and must be at least reviewed annually. The team includes the child's teacher, the parents, subject to certain limited expectations, the child, if determined appropriate, an agency representative who is qualified to provide or supervise the provision of special education, and other individuals at the parents' or agency's discretion. And this was passed originally in 1990, and then in 2004 it had another revamp, but that had to do mostly with how test scores were done. You don't need to worry about it. And then real quick here, there's some additional legislation for you. So there's Section 508, that's from 1998, and that stipulated that federal agencies must make electronic and information technology accessible. And then there was the Assistive Technology Act in 2004, and that provided direct aid to ensure people with disabilities have access to the technology they need at home and at work. And then this one's kind of a mouthful, the 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act in 2018. And that requires federal agencies to modernize websites and digital services. And thank goodness for that one. Some websites, especially like government ones, were made in like 2000 and then they just didn't get touched. I'm looking at you, DMV. Now actually the DMV's website's not bad these days. And it's probably because of this act. So what are some current issues facing people with disabilities? Well, it's kind of a long list, unfortunately. At the top of this list, especially this year, is better access to health care. Medicaid and Medicare are the only insurance they can get, but not all providers take it. And that's a really big deal. That can be the difference between going to a doctor down your street or going to a doctor 45 minutes down the freeway. Then there's the issue of Social Security benefits for persons with disabilities only being available to the lowest income learners. Now, on paper, that kind of makes sense, but if you're like just outside that bracket, you can really get hurt by that, and you need those benefits, but you're not going to get them. And then centers for independent living are facing funding issues. And, these centers are really important. They help people gain skills to become independent, as the name implies. But they also take care of people who cannot live on their own. And unfortunately, these places are easy to forget about if you're not part of that community. But we can't forget about them. They're very important. And voter registration is lower for people with disabilities. And restrictions of mail-in voting could make it harder for people to vote. So overall, things have gotten a little bit better. We're on the right track, but we are by no means finished. We're going to talk a lot more about this in class, but I hope this video was a good little supplement for you. That's all I got for you. Bye.